In the closing months of 1884, the grand imperial powers of Europe gathered in the smoke-filled salons of Berlin to execute one of the most calculated acts of geopolitical theft in human history. With large, sweeping maps of Africa spread across polished mahogany tables, diplomats armed with ink stamps and fountain pens divided an entire continent into arbitrary colonies. These empires, including Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, firmly believed that no indigenous African nation could ever hope to resist the overwhelming onslaught of modern European industrial power and military discipline. Yet, thousands of miles to the south, nestled within the impenetrable, towering volcanic massifs of the Horn of Africa, the ancient empire of Abyssinia, known to the world as Ethiopia, stood in fierce and absolute defiance. Unlike many of the lands around it, this was a deeply unified empire whose rulers traced their sacred lineage back 3,000 years to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Protected by a majestic mountain fortress, it was a highly organized Orthodox Christian powerhouse that had preserved its independence and distinct culture since antiquity. Having only achieved its national unification in the year 1861, the young and highly ambitious Kingdom of Italy arrived late to the competitive imperial feast. Seeking to secure global prestige, validate its status as a great power, and carve out a glorious new Rome on the African continent, short-sighted Italian politicians targeted the fertile strategic highlands of Ethiopia. Driven by profound hubris and racial arrogance, they foolishly expected a swift, effortless military walkover that would instantly cement their imperial dominance. In 1889, following a period of intense internal consolidation, the visionary and technologically fascinated Emperor Menelik II ascended the Ethiopian throne as the undisputed King of Kings. Strongly desiring to safeguard his borders and establish formal international relations, he signed the historic Treaty of Wuchale with the Italian diplomatic envoy, Count Pietro Antonelli. In the eyes of the international community, the agreement was widely celebrated as a monumental triumph of mutual respect and eternal brotherhood. Behind the public celebrations, however, the treaty concealed a malicious, carefully designed linguistic trap hidden entirely within the boundaries of Article 6 and Team. In the native Amharic version of the text, vetted by the Ethiopian court, the article stated that Ethiopia could choose to utilize Italy's diplomatic channels for foreign affairs. But in the Italian version, signed in Rome, the text was secretly altered to state that Ethiopia must transact all foreign business through Italy, effectively reducing a sovereign empire to a helpless protectorate. When the duplicitous translation was finally uncovered by royal interpreters, Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's brilliant co-ruler and fiercest political advisor, unleashed an unyielding storm of fury upon the Italian envoy. She loudly declared that she would rather see her people perish than surrender the dignity of their ancestors, fiercely telling Rome, "If you want war, we will give you war." Backed by his empress, Menelik formally tore up the corrupted treaty, repaid his loans, and prepared his kingdom for imminent conflict. In September of 1895, as the heavy tropical rains began to recede from the capital, Menelik II ordered the thunderous beating of the Nagarit royal war drums and issued a passionate imperial mobilization proclamation. He called upon every patriot to rise up and defend their ancient faith, their families, and their sacred motherland against the invading foreign forces. Strikingly, long-standing internal rivalries and blood feuds vanished instantly as independent regional lords unified beneath the imperial banner. An astonishing human tide of over 100,000 warriors rapidly marched north into the rugged terrain of Tigray, accompanied by an estimated 50,000 camp followers. This vast logistics network was masterfully organized by the women of Ethiopia, who managed the grain supplies, ground flour along the harsh trails, and prepared traditional injera to sustain the soldiers' fighting spirits. Moving light and unburdened through the vertical mountain passes, they completely bypassed the slow, heavy supply chains that paralyzed Western armies. The Italian military command confidently expected to face a disorganized, primitive tribal rabble armed only with iron spears and hide shields. Instead, they were marching directly toward a modern, highly motivated army that was thoroughly prepared for 19th-century warfare. For nearly a decade, Menelik had utilized European trade rivalries to systematically stockpile over 80,000 modern, breech-loading European rifles, along with advanced ammunition, smokeless powder, and highly capable mountain artillery units. In December 1895, the battle-hardened vanguard of the advancing Ethiopian army finally clashed with an advanced Italian force stationed at the formidable mountain fortress of Amba Alagi. Rather than launching a predictable and costly frontal assault, the Ethiopian commanders utilized their deep familiarity with the jagged highland terrain to execute a brilliant flanking maneuver. They swarmed up the seemingly impassable cliff faces, caught the garrison by surprise, and completely shattered the Italian vanguard line. Riding the momentum of their initial victory, Menelik's forces advanced to surround a significant, heavily fortified Italian garrison entrenched inside the formidable fort at Mekelle. Rather than ordering a bloody and destructive infantry charge against modern machine guns, Empress Taytu observed the layout of the valley and directed the Ethiopian troops to seize the heights overlooking the fort's primary water source. By cutting off the stream, she forced a desperate, dehydrated Italian surrender after 15 agonizing days. In a masterclass of psychological and diplomatic warfare, Menelik chose not to execute or mistreat the captured garrison, instead granting them full safe conduct back to their main lines with their weapons and honors intact. This calculating act of Christian mercy demonstrated to the watching world that Ethiopia was a highly civilized, compassionate nation that strictly respected the laws of warfare. This brilliant move made it politically impossible for other major European powers to intervene on Italy's behalf. By February 1896, Italian General Oreste Baratieri found himself heavily outnumbered and effectively paralyzed by fear at his fortified camp in Sauria. He preferred to wait out the Ethiopians, knowing their food supplies were dwindling but furious. Insulting telegrams arrived daily from Prime Minister Francesco Crispi in Rome. Crispi accused the general of cowardice and demanded an immediate aggressive offensive to save the political standing of the government, forcing Baratieri into a reckless gamble. On the pitch-black, fog-covered night of February 29th, Baratieri ordered a surprise night march directly into the treacherous mountains surrounding Adwa. The overly complex Italian strategy required the army to advance along 3 separate, parallel mountain tracks to quietly seize the commanding high ground before the sun rose. The plan looked flawless on paper, but it completely ignored the brutal reality of the Ethiopian geography and the exhaustion of the soldiers. The jagged mountains of Tigray quickly proved to be a vertical, unforgiving labyrinth of deep ravines, steep volcanic cliffs, and dead-end valleys. Guided only by crude, profoundly inaccurate maps in the blinding darkness and dense mountain mist, the 3 Italian columns completely lost contact with one another. Units became hopelessly entangled at narrow choke points, communication broke down entirely, and the isolated brigades marched blindly through the night, separated and vulnerable. At dawn on March 1, 1896, the isolated Italian left column emerged from the heavy mountain fog, only to realize they had accidentally marched straight into the vanguard of the main Ethiopian camp. Menelik II did not hesitate, immediately deploying his massive force as the roar of war drums filled the valleys. Over 100,000 fiercely patriotic warriors poured down from the surrounding heights like an unstoppable landslide, rapidly engulfing and overrunning the exposed Italian lines. As the Italian right column desperately scrambled through the rocky passes to reinforce their collapsing comrades, they were misdirected into a narrow, dead-end valley. There, They were violently ambushed by a fresh force of Ethiopian patriots and the legendary highly feared Oromo cavalry. The swift horsemen swept down the steep slopes with absolute ferocity, cutting off all avenues of escape and decimating the isolated Italian brigade in a brutal display of close-quarters combat. With the invading Italian lines fractured and falling into absolute panic, Menelik unleashed his final, devastating tactical weapon, the elite 25,000-strong Imperial Guard, personally led onto the battlefield by the Emperor and Empress. The profound psychological shock of seeing their own sovereigns leading the charge galvanized the Ethiopian forces into an unstoppable fury. The Italian center completely buckled, and by noon, the pride of the Italian colonial empire dissolved into a catastrophic, panicked rout. The brief but catastrophic battle left nearly 6,000 Italian and colonial soldiers dead upon the rocky slopes of Adwa, with another 3,000 taken as prisoners of war. When the news of this unprecedented defeat reached Europe via telegraph, it sent an earth-shattering shockwave through the Western world. Violent anti-war riots immediately erupted in the streets of Rome, Milan, and Naples, and Prime Minister Crispi's imperialistic government collapsed in total political disgrace. In October of 1896, a humbled Italy was forced to sign the historic Treaty of Addis Ababa, which officially annulled the deceptive Treaty of Wuchale and compelled Rome to pay a massive financial war indemnity. Most importantly, the treaty forced Italy to unconditionally recognize the absolute, unrestricted independence and sovereignty of the Ethiopian Empire. Ethiopia had achieved the impossible, standing tall as one of the few African nations to completely crush a European colonial invasion. The monumental victory at Adwa permanently transformed Ethiopia into a global symbol of Black dignity, resilience, and anti-colonial resistance. Its historic green, yellow, and red flag became the definitive colors of global Pan-Africanism, proudly adopted by dozens of newly independent African nations decades later during the mid-20th century. The legacy of March 1, 1896, endures as a timeless historical reminder that unity, strategic brilliance, and the unyielding will of a people can successfully turn back the tides of empire.